Story 1. The Man by the Pond. When I was 21, I often found myself alone at my parents' house. They owned a beautiful large lot that was surrounded by a small pond that stretched out behind the house. The pond was surrounded by dense trees on one side and a small little used park on the other. The neighborhood was affluent, with houses spaced far apart, giving each one a sense of isolation. Our house, one of several my parents owned, became my refuge during college breaks, a place where I could decompress from school. It was a warm summer night, and I was alone in the house, as usual. I sat in the sunroom, my favorite place in the house. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the television, and with the windows open, a gentle breeze blew in, carrying with it the pleasant sounds of the night. I was absorbed in my program when a faint sound from outside caught my attention. At first, it was just a gentle splashing on the pond, nothing unusual since ducks and geese often swam there. But the noise continued, growing louder and more rhythmic, and soon I realized it was too heavy to be made by any animal. Curiosity got the better of me, and I lowered the volume on the TV and pressed my ear to the window. The splashing continued, and now mixed with it was a low, almost melodic hum. My heart began to beat faster. The sound was distinctly human. Someone was in the pond. I opened the sunroom door and stepped onto the deck, peering into the darkness. The pond, usually serene and inviting, now seemed like a pitch-black void hiding something or someone in its depth. As I strained my eyes, the buzzing stopped abruptly, and so did the splashing. Whoever it was, they had seen me. A wave of unease washed over me. It could have been a neighbor, though the thought of someone swimming in that pond was strange. No one had ever done that before. But the alternative was far more unsettling, a stranger trespassing in the middle of the night. I quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind me. I texted my brother, but he didn't respond right away. My mind raced with thoughts of who it could be and why they were there, but I tried to focus on the TV again, still every creak in the house. Then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible sound from the deck. I muted the TV, silencing the room, and the sound became clearer, heavy breathing coming from just outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was out there, inches away, separated only by a thin layer of glass. Instinctively, I slid down on the couch, hoping the darkness would conceal me. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a deep, husky voice broke the silence. "I see you." My blood ran cold. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a prank or a neighbor? I desperately hoped so and whispered, "Paul, is that you?" Paul was one of our neighbors, and I clung to the hope that it was just him, playing a cruel joke. But the silence that followed was deafening. No answer. Only footsteps, slow and cautious, moving away from the window. I remained motionless, paralyzed with fear, for what seemed like an eternity. When I finally mustered up the courage, I bolted from the chair and checked the locks on every door, my hands shaking. My father's voice echoed in my mind, telling me to be the man of the house, to protect it. So I grabbed a kitchen knife and cautiously approached the back door. My hand shook as I turned on the light, illuminating the deck and a small section of the pond. At first, everything seemed normal. But then I noticed the wet footprints on the wooden floor, barely visible but unmistakable. They led around the side of the house. I held my breath as I followed them, my heart pounding so hard I was sure anyone out there could hear them. As I rounded the corner, my eyes locked on something that made my blood run cold. Just above the edge of the deck, peeking out of the darkness, were eyes. The top of a man's head, only his eyes and forehead barely visible, but watching me intently. He must have heard me coming and was waiting now, silent, like a predator. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife. The man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me rooted to the spot, unable to move or even scream. The realization hit me hard. This was no joke. This was real, and I was in danger. I rushed back inside and locked every door, my fingers fumbling with the phone as I dialed 911. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found no trace of the man. The footprints were mostly dry, and there was nothing to lead them to who had been out. My parents, concerned but skeptical, asked if we had any enemies or if it was just a harmless prank. But I knew better. The way those eyes looked at me, the way the man whispered that he saw me. This was no joke. That night, I closed every window and turned on the air conditioning, needing the sense of security that locked doors and artificial breezes provided. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see the sunlight pouring in, chasing away the darkness and terror of the night. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. I moved out of that house soon after, and my parents eventually sold it. But even now, years later, I can still hear that voice, still see those eyes staring at me from the darkness. And I know that some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Story 2. Shadows in the Woods. Back in 2010, my friends and I planned a camping trip to a remote forest in Oregon. We were an adventurous bunch, always looking for new experiences and challenges. This particular location was miles away from the nearest town, hidden deep in a vast forest that stretched to the horizon. It was perfect, completely cut off from civilization, with only the sounds of nature to keep us company. The first night was the usual, setting up camp, building a fire, and telling stories late into the night. The air was light, filled with laughter and the crackling of the fire. As night fell, the forest around us darkened, the trees becoming towering silhouettes against the starry sky. We could hear distant owls hooting and the rustling of leaves as tiny creatures moved around. It was peaceful, even serene. But as the fire died down, I began to notice something strange. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of nature, seemed to have become eerily silent. The usual background noise of insects and nocturnal animals gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. I glanced at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice anything unusual. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own paranoia, and eventually, we all retreated to our tents for the night. I woke up a few hours later, my bladder urging me to step outside. The air was cold, the kind that could penetrate your clothes and chill you to the bone. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, trying not to wake it. The fire had died down completely, leaving the campsite almost pitch black. The only light came from the faint sliver of moonlight peeking through the dense canopy above. I walked a short distance from the tent, not wanting to venture too far into the woods. As I went to the bathroom, I heard it, a soft rustling, as if something were moving slowly through the underbrush. I turned, sweeping the flashlight over the trees, but saw nothing. The noise stopped, and I stood there for a moment, listening intently. Nothing. Just the silence of the forest. Pushing aside my unease, I turned to head back toward camp. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A shadow, darker than the surrounding forest, standing among the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, squinting to see what it was. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if watching me. I slowly lifted the flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the light didn't seem to penetrate the darkness. The figure didn't react, didn't move. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to blend into the surrounding trees. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague black shape in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Whatever it wasn't human. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and menacing. I couldn't see any eyes. Suddenly, the figure shifted, slowly walking forward. My blood ran cold, and I ran back to the campsite, not daring to look back. I crawled into the tent, my hands shaking as I zipped it up as fast as I could. I lay there listening to my heart pounding in my ears, too scared to close my eyes, but too terrified to move. As the night dragged on, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump with fear. I kept expecting to hear footsteps approaching or to see a shadowy figure looming outside the thin fabric of the tent. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my friends moving around the campsite. The sun had risen, casting a warm golden light across the forest, making the events of the night before seem like a distant nightmare. I tried to shake off the fear that clung to me like a second skin, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But as we gathered around the fire to cook breakfast, I noticed something that made my blood run cold again. One of my friends, Kevin, was unusually quiet, his face pale and sad. He was usually the life of the party, telling jokes and keeping the mood light, but today he seemed haunted, as if he hadn't slept at all. I pulled him aside and asked him what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around nervously before speaking. "Last night, I saw something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My heart pounded as I looked at him, my mind raced. "What did you see?" I asked, dreading the answer. Kevin swallowed, eyes wide with fear. "It was in the woods, right outside my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw it standing there. It was tall, taller than anyone, with long arms, and it was just looking at me." A chill ran down my spine as he described the exact image I'd seen. We both stood there, silent, as the realization hit. We weren't alone out there. Something was watching us, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. We didn't tell the others, not wanting to scare them, but the rest of the trip was tense, with Kevin and I constantly on edge, constantly looking back. We cut our trip short and left the next day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched the whole time. Years have passed since that night, but I still think about it often. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just our imaginations running wild in the dark. But deep down, I know what we saw was real. There was something in those woods, something that didn't belong there. And it's still out there watching, waiting. Story 3. The Visitor at the Window. In 2013, my family lived in an old Victorian house in a quiet town in Pennsylvania. One stormy night, my parents went out, leaving me to watch my 8-year-old sister Lily. After dinner, I put Lily to bed, but she seemed restless, mentioning her friend who didn't want her to sleep. I dismissed it as her active imagination and headed downstairs. As the storm continued, I felt a growing sense of unease, though I couldn't quite place why. Around 11 p.m., I went to check on Lily. I found her sitting upright in bed, staring out the window. My heart pounded as I followed her gaze. There, pressed against the second-story window, was a face pale, sunken, and smiling crookedly. It wasn't a reflection. The figure seemed to move, its eyes locked on mine. The air grew unbearably cold, and I felt paralyzed. Lily broke the silence with a whisper. "He's back. He wants to play." I grabbed her without thinking, storming out of the room and slamming the door behind us. We locked ourselves in my bedroom, huddled together, too afraid to move. The storm outside was deafening, but inside, the silence was oppressive. When our parents returned, they dismissed it as a nightmare. But Lily was never the same after that night. We moved away a few years later, but the memory of the face by the window still haunts me. I know what I saw that night, and I will never forget it.